Alrighty, we are good to go. Hello, everybody. I'm joined by Lance from at Lance Independent. Today we're going to be talking about metaethics, philosophy, analytic philosophy, and maybe at the end a little bit of philosophy of religion if we've got time. So, yeah, thanks for coming on, Lance. I really appreciate it.
Yep. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So I have a set list of questions. We don't have to follow it like to the word, but hopefully it'll give this video some structure and make some sense for the people at home. I know you said that you don't specialize in evolutionary debunking arguments, but I guess from my point of view, I'm really interested in the role that intuitions play in our moral judgments and our moral actions and moral talk. And I know that that's something that you are particularly interested in. So I'm wondering if we can talk a bit about evolution, bring that in, and hopefully have a good conversation. So yeah,
Absolutely.
sorry, just something. Okay, we're good. Awesome. I can't. Where did I? There we go. There we go. Okay. So how there's the first question, just to lay our cards on the table. Um, what ethical position, or sorry, what meta ethical position do you think best describes you?
So it's an interesting question because the kind of position that I endorse doesn't really have a name because I reject all the traditional anti-realist positions. So I am a moral anti-realist and I do follow the sort of standard conventions for what that means, which is that I maintain the position that there are no stance independent moral facts. So I think moral realism is not true. So that in that respect, I'm on board with, and I fall within the anti-realist sort of umbrella. However, within that umbrella, there are typically three major positions that are outlined. There are nuances and complications and positions that sort of fit between the cracks or are hard to place. But the standard three are going to be some type of relativism or subjectivism. Then you're going to have error theory, and then you're going to have non-cognitivism. Now, the first one with relativism, I should make one point, a caveat about that. Some forms of relativism are going to be anti-realist, but technically there are forms of relativism that are consistent with realism. So when I say relativism, I mean just specifically stance-dependent accounts of morality, and that includes relativism as well as some constructivist positions, relation designating accounts, and a variety of accounts where there are moral facts and those facts are stance dependent. And so really stance dependent cognitivism or something like that would be like a better description for that category, but no one calls it that. So that's one of them. Then you're going to get error theory, which it claims that all first order moral claims are systematically false. And so, you just don't have moral facts, like objective or stance independent moral facts at all. Although technically the stance dependent accounts hold that too, they just also hold there are moral facts, they're just stance dependent. And then you have the non-cognitivist accounts, which ultimately center, and this is true of all of these in their traditional form, they center on semantic theses. But this is actually, I guess, is especially true of error theory as well. But the non-cognitivist accounts hold that moral claims aren't even propositional; they're not even in the business of attempting to describe moral facts, and so they're not true or false. They express emotions or they issue imperatives, and so there are no moral facts. It's just that stuff like murder is wrong actually is best understood to mean something like murder, boo, your classical emotivism, or don't murder, which can't be evaluated as true or false. So those are the traditional positions, and I mentioned the semantic component to them. Error theory typically has the semantic thesis, which is that moral claims attempt to describe an objective reality, but they fail to do so because there is no objective reality to which they refer. So they sort of systematically fail to refer to objective facts. But again, it's fundamentally about the linguistic practice. It's like the semantics of the moral claims. And then relativism as well treats moral claims as having this implicit indexical element. And you're going to get the same thing for stance-dependent accounts more generally, which is that they're typically going to hash out the semantics of moral claims in such a way so as to treat them as referring to stance-dependent moral facts. So all of them are going to rest on these semantic theses. My problem with that is that I both reject more foundationally the underlying presumptions about the way language works, on which these accounts typically seem to rest. And to the extent that they are taking these claims to be, so for me, I take claims about the meaning of moral claims to be empirical. They're claims about, you could say, the communicative intent of the speakers. It's about what people are doing when they make moral claims. And I take those questions to be empirical questions. And in principle, it could be that as a matter of empirical fact, when people make moral claims, they're issuing imperatives or expressing emotions, but they're not attempting to describe a moral reality, in which case you would have, like, empirically speaking, you'd have some kind of non-cognitivism. Or it could be that they are attempting to refer to these objective facts, but they fail to do so, in which case you get error theory. Or it could be that people are some type of implicit relativist. But I think all of the empirical case for that is really questionable. I don't think that there is a single correct account of what people are doing when they make moral claims. I think they could be doing any and all of these in different combinations at different times. And so at the very least, if nothing else, I would endorse some type of like meaning pluralism about the meaning of moral claims. So when people are making moral claims, sometimes they're attempting to describe an objective reality and they're mistaken because there isn't one. So you get error theory for those claims. Sometimes they're relativists, in which case I don't really have an issue with what's being stated, like philosophically speaking, like they're not incorrect. In fact, I'd take them to be trivially true. Because like murder's wrong would mean like murder's inconsistent with my standards. Well, if it is, then that's just trivially true. Maybe not very interesting claim. And then sometimes people maybe are expressing emotions or issuing imperatives. However, my own work focuses on this empirical question. So my background's actually in psychology, and I specialize in the psychology of metaethics. I do philosophy as well, but the main training is in psychology. And what I've argued in my recent work is that most people without substantive philosophical training aren't determinately committed to any of these positions at all, and they don't speak or think in ways that comport with any of these positions at all. And this is called metaethical indeterminacy. The first place I located this, I didn't invent this notion, was in a paper back from 2009 by Michael Gill, where Gill proposes metaethical variability and indeterminacy as possible solutions to the intractability of 20th century descriptive metaethical accounts of moral semantics. Gill basically says, hey, maybe all these disputes seem so irresolvable because on the one hand, maybe they're all true to some extent about some pockets of discourse, or maybe people have no determinate commitments at all. And the comparison that Gill uses is to mathematical Platonism. Imagine a person like tallying up the bill at like calculating a tip at a restaurant, or children doing a math class and they hear 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 2 = 4. When they're thinking through those issues or calculating the tip at a restaurant, are they committed to, or do they explicitly endorse the view of mathematical Platonism? That seems really implausible. But it also seems implausible that they're anti-Platonists. They just don't have a position about that at all. Nothing about the way that they speak or think about mathematics requires or involves a stance in mathematical Platonism. And then Gill says, maybe it's the same for morality. So that was a very long answer to your question, but it's essential to give that sort of contextualization, because since I reject the fundamental assumptions behind the major positions, I just fall completely outside their ambit. And so there's just nowhere to place my position in terms of like a conventional label. So, often the anti-realist and realist positions follow this flow chart. And I can't answer the first question in the flow chart, so there's no way for me to participate in it. Okay, so I have sometimes used the name metaethical quietism. And that is intended to convey that I think that because the underlying assumptions are conceptually flawed, that there's no meaningful way to engage in these discussions from the outset. And so we just shouldn't bother going through that flow chart in the first place, just reject the whole thing. And we need a fundamentally different orientation towards approaching metaethics from the outset. There are complications with that. Quietism is often depicted as a broad attitude towards philosophy as a whole, and this is a more sort of localized attitude towards a particular philosophical issue. I have sympathies with this, a broad quietism, but that's not what I'm trying to convey with this specific thing, because you can endorse this without being like a quietist in general. And then other people, might dispute whether quietism is an appropriate label. The term, it's like kind of just picked up by people and used and employed and deployed in different sorts of ways. And so it's already out there. And so using an existing term to describe this position might not be the optimal approach. So I'm thinking of like, maybe I just need a completely new label for the position. So I guess at the moment I would say there's not really a name for the position, but it's some type of anti-realism.
Okay, that was really good. I appreciate that. A lot of detail there. One of the takeaways I got from that was the function of language, or what language is trying to do, or what it is doing. Um, I don't know much about philosophy of language, but would you say that language attempts to describe things in the world, or do you think of language as doing something else?
So I don't think the language itself, and maybe you didn't mean this literally, I don't think the language itself does anything. I see language as essentially a behavior, and it's a behavior that humans engage in. Non-humans could, in principle, engage in language too. We could get AIs or aliens that use language as well. And what it ultimately serves to do is to achieve the goals of the agents employing the language. It's a type of behavior that is utilized to, among other things, convey information, issue commands. Its function is to get things done. And so, because it's a behavior, ultimately, I see it as something that is best understood, through the empirical sciences. That does not mean that philosophy and potentially a priori considerations couldn't play a role, including a very substantial role. But language is not magic, and I don't think words or sentences or paragraphs have intrinsic meaning. So, often philosophers will talk, maybe literally, maybe metaphorically, about the meaning of words or the meaning of sentences. But I don't think words and sentences mean anything. I think they're
Right.
used to convey the meaning, or you could say the intentions of speakers. And so the approach I would take is very roughly psychological. That isn't to say that there aren't facts from a broad range of the social and hard sciences. There's going to be facts about neurophysiology that are relevant to understanding language, developmental psychology, anthropology, history, sociology. Like, all of these fields either have or potentially have substantial input, but my emphasis is going to tend to be psychological. So because I view language that way, a lot of things end up following from that. And the things that follow from that put me at odds with the way I think that many philosophers approach language. I think they have a lot of often unstated, but when they are explicitly stated, they strike me as very strange views about the way that language works. And a lot of my reaction to that is not so much grounded in substantive philosophy of language accounts, but it's more drawing sort of diffusely in research in language cognition, general psychological considerations, and it's often largely reactive and dialectical. So when philosophers start talking about this or that word meaning something, it's not so much that I'm bringing to bear a substantive, comprehensive theory of language to say, you're operating in the wrong theory of language, but rather it's that, if a philosopher says, when people make moral claims, those claims are propositional, I'm going to have a lot of questions. How do they distinguish what is or isn't a moral claim? Which moral claims are they talking about? So, like, if someone says moral claims express propositions and have a truth value, which moral claims? Like, do they mean that every time that a person says murder is wrong, that person is intending to express a proposition? I don't think they mean that. And presumably it's not every time. And there are allowances that I would make even on those views. A person could misspeak, a person could be confused, a person could be sarcastic. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about, if we know that the word dog refers to like the animal, like I point to a dog and I say the word, like, this is a dog, it refers to the specific animal. If someone is joking and they point at a cat and say that's a dog, and they're linguistically competent and they know what they're doing, that does not mean that the word dog, like, now the referent is all over the place, because sometimes it refers to dogs. But no, the person's being, we can still understand, like, the correct reference is dog. I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is the underspecificity of what it is they're even attempting to account for. Are they accounting for a psychological state? How are they distinguishing what is and isn't a moral claim in the first place? And is this like a stipulative account? So, like, in other words, if we discovered that, say, 20% of the time is a matter of empirical fact, when people said stuff like murder's wrong or lying is wrong or whatever, they were just issuing commands or expressing emotions, would they say, well, then those aren't instances of moral sentences in the first place? Okay, well, then this is just an account that's just stipulating. I am stipulating that there's a certain way you could use a sentence that would be propositional as a matter of like, as a trivial matter of analytic truth. I'm just saying, here's a type of sentence that would be and just as a matter of analyticity, an expression of a propositional claim. But then it's going to become an empirical question whether, as a matter of empirical fact, when people say murder is wrong, how often that's what they're trying to do. And that fact would obtain regardless of whether they think that language is and like meaning is reducible to communicative intent. In other words, there are still going to be psychological facts about communicative intent, regardless of one's account of language. And so I'm still going to have concerns if someone just stipulates those aren't moral claims. If we went out and we found all these people saying murder's wrong, no, it's not. And like technically they're not doing what the philosopher thinks is it, like they're not intending to communicate what the philosopher thinks is the correct account. Okay, well, what are they doing? What's going on there? Those seem like important questions to me. So I think the way that a lot of philosophers approach language and meaning, it stands in a sort of potentially weird disconnect with actual human practice and psychology. If they want to embed it in and regard it as constituted by human psychology, they're going to have to face up to the empirical facts in the way that I approach it. If they're not, that doesn't really get them out of the problem because those empirical facts about communicative intent and what people are actually doing and the actual function to which people are employing language, like what they're trying to do, those facts are going to obtain anyway. And so they could have this really ephemeral, weird account of language. Okay, so everybody's systematically saying things, but it's not what they're intending to do isn't what the sentences mean. I mean, you could say that, but you're going to start getting these accounts where, to the extent that that's true, the more sort of actual practice is inconsistent with that, the more those accounts of language are disconnected from actual human practice, and the more I guess you could say they might not be false, but they would be in a certain sense sort of trivial, or like it's not clear what they're doing at that point. And I would say that this is generally true of the way a lot of these meta-ethical accounts go, is they'll offer these really sophisticated analyses like this deflationary view of truth and language could function this way. And it's not clear, are these empirical accounts? Are they subject to empirical investigation? It's, if you read these accounts, it's just not clear what the authors are attempting to do. What, like, I don't know if they're describing human psychology or not. And I think this reflects a more general problem with metaethics, which is that I would have thought it would be more connected to actual human practice than psychology. And contemporary analytic metaethics just doesn't seem to be. And so there's something very strange there.
Nice. So would it be fair to say that you think of language as a tool, and that what philosophers are trying to do is they're trying to figure out how people use that tool in their daily lives? And your issue is that their conceptualization of how they're using that tool just does not map onto the way that real world, like you said, real world psychology and the way real world people act and use language. Is that a fair characterization?
Sort of. I mean, it could happen to map onto it, but the question is whether that's what they're trying to do in the first place. And it's not clear
The
that it is.
the like ordinary people using language as a tool, or philosophers?
No, what I'm saying is I'm not sure that philosophers are really attempting to, like, for
Okay.
me, I would say, okay, well, if I wanted to find out how people use moral language, I would embark on this empirical saga to like go and study. You get anthropologists, you get psychologists, you do like corpus analysis. You would
Yeah.
use empirical tools to figure out what they're doing with the language. It would be an empirical
Right.
investigation. Um, it's not clear to me that philosophers are doing that. If they are doing that, like I mean, one, I don't think they're trying to do what I'm trying to do. So whatever they're trying to do is something different than that, I think. Second, let's just suppose that is what they were trying to do. They were actually trying to capture like the communicative intent or the function of language. Now, I should say I don't think function is necessarily completely reducible to communicative intent. There could be functions that operate, in a more diffuse or like broader way. So there could be that the language is functioning to achieve things that falls outside the scope of direct individual intent, and it also doesn't have to be represented in some sort of explicit representational way. Like a person doesn't have to consciously think, I am intending to do this in order for their language to function to achieve certain sorts of things. So it could be, for instance, that a great deal of moral discourse functions to facilitate the development and maintenance of cooperative norms, even if people aren't explicitly and consciously trying to do that. So I also should say, I'm not trying to offer this like really rigid, simple, and I would think like, I would say obviously false account of like moral discourse or discourse more generally, which is that it all is it completely subsumed by the conscious intentions of agents. I'm not saying that. That would be goofy. Uh, so, right. So the issue would be if philosophers were trying to do what I'm trying to do, the way I view language as a behavior, uh, why why did they use armchair methods? So like they're not doing these empirical investigations, they're not doing corpus analysis, they're not becoming anthropologists, they're not conducting psychological research, they don't sit down and talk with non-philosophers in a systematic empirical way and like gather notes. They're not doing interviews, they're not doing surveys, most of them anyway, and the ones that are might agree with me. So instead, what they do is they take these isolated, decontextualized instances of sentences. So the typical contemporary analytic meta-ethicist would not go out and examine actual sentences used in real world contexts. What they would do is they would think, what is meant by murder is wrong? And then they would think through from the armchair how you might deploy that. So one example of this would be like the Frege-Geach problem, where they would say, okay, well, take a sentence like murder is wrong. Well, it looks like there's no grammatical issue or there's not any sort of obvious semantic issue or conceptual problem with embedding that in an argument or deliberating about it. It would be really weird if murder is wrong simply conveyed like don't murder. It would be weird to deliberate about that or embed it in an argument, because how can it figure into an argument if it's not even a proposition? So it looks like you could say something like, assassination is a form of murder. If something is a form of murder, then it is wrong. Therefore, assassination is wrong. So like you can embed, it looks like, and then you examine that. And then the philosopher appeals to their judgments about, is there anything wrong with this? Does it look weird? And the answer is no. And so it's because it looks like murder is wrong functions like a proposition. It is a proposition. And presumably this is intended to generalize to ordinary language. So then you would say, okay, well, when ordinary people make oral claims, they're expressing propositions. Why? Well, the language functions like a proposition. The problem with that is that it's basically armchair psychology if it's intended to be psychology. Now, armchair psychology is crap. Like we can't do a good job with psychological research as it is. That is, with replication crisis and problems with p hacking and just the massive amounts of challenges that we face in the systematic acquisition of empirical data. It's already a challenge to figure out what people are doing with a sentence or whatever. If you had 1,000 participants or 200 or 50, but the philosophers in this case are taking themselves to be like, it's something I frequently say is that if this is intended to be psychology, it's psychology with a sample size of 1. And that's very bad psychology. So if they're doing psychology, they're doing a terrible job. If they are not doing psychology, then I'm not clear on what they're doing, and I question its legitimacy. So it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right. So from your perspective, you really want to start with the psychology and then build from that. Is that right?
You don't have to start with the psychology. I don't see any problem with philosophy and psychology being in a iterative dynamic interplay with one another. There's no reason why you couldn't start with certain sorts of presumptions or intuitions or philosophical inclinations. I see it much more like this metaphor of Neurath's boat. So if you're on a boat, like we're already on the boat, we're already reasoning, we're already deliberating by the time we start considering any of this stuff. And so if you're on that boat and you notice cracks and leaks and problems in the boat, you have to fix the boat while you're in it. You can never get off the boat. You can't put it in some harbor somewhere and start fixing it up. Your only option is to fix what you're already working from. And so by the time we're doing psychology, we're already starting with certain sorts of philosophical assumptions. So a lot of the sort of foundation, like the foundationalist approaches and a prioristic reasoning and phenomenal conservatism, I don't have massive fundamental issues with those. I might ultimately reject foundationalist approaches to epistemology, but I don't, they're not like so at odds with my worldview that I'm like, no, throughout the philosophy, you have to start with science and empirical stuff. And then the philosophy is allowed to come in later. I don't have any issue with starting with philosophy. What I think people need to do is to not be so rigid in seeing the methodological and disciplinary boundaries as so autonomous and distinct in the first place. So I don't see psychology as like, it's not like I think that you have here, over here is your lab, and over here is your armchair, and you could sit in the armchair and do philosophy, or you could go to the lab and do science, and never the twain should meet. No, put the damn armchair in the lab and do both at the same time. That's my general take on this. So yeah, neither really precedes the other. And really, if someone said you absolutely have to pick, I guess maybe I would pick philosophy first. I don't know. So maybe that puts me less at odds with a lot of the rationalists than they might have initially supposed. Although we're still going to be very at odds anyway.
Okay, so you see it as an in dynamic. Um, there's a relationship between philosophy and psychology and the sciences, and you'd like to see them come together more than they are currently. Is that?
Yeah, historically, science and philosophy weren't so institutionally distinguished in the first place. So philosophers used to be mathematicians and scientists. They would be doing experiments and collecting observational data, and doing all that sort of stuff. And it's just a matter of history and sociology and the way that institutions ended up developing, that we ended up getting all these disciplinary divisions. And then you have the really specific things that ended up happening with Western philosophy, where you have this, you have the linguistic turn, and like we can't get into the whole history, but the sort of current distinctions and the way that philosophers, as a matter of like identity and methodology and all these other facets of the way that philosophers do what they do today, and I'm thinking specifically of analytic philosophers, and the way that scientists do what they do today, I think that's largely a sort of historical accident. It didn't have to be that way. And so it's not so much that it's always been the labs over there and the armchairs over here, and I'm saying let's bring them together. I'm saying historically there was never a robust distinction in the first place. And so I want a sort of return to the integration of them. This is not, I'm not the first person like to suggest this. So this is not a new idea. If you read some of the early work of experimental philosophers like Josh Knobe and some of the other people that have done work on this sort of thing, where, they're doing empirical work as philosophers, they make a point of saying, this is not like a novel suggestion. What we're actually doing is saying, let's go back to the way it used to be in a certain sense. And so I'm suggesting the same. Although I should say, psychology specifically is fairly new on the scene. So we're not going back to the old ways so much as we're going back to a distinction in a sort of new way, where it's old way, like updated. It's the reintegration 2.0, I guess you could say.
Cool. Would you see that, and this gets to one of our later questions, trying to find a common methodology from one discipline and applying it to another? So I know that Graham Oppy uses simplicity and inference for the best explanation. These are concepts from philosophy of science, and he's bringing that over to philosophy of religion and arguing against the existence of God. So I'm wondering, do you think a similar thing can be done in the case of metaethics?
Yes. Yeah. So I don't really have any problem with drawing on. I don't know why I'm saying it's not having a problem. Yeah, I think you could draw on tools in philosophy of science and just, I guess you could say, philosophy more broadly and science more broadly, and bring all of it to bear on metaethical questions. I mean, my own work exemplifies this because I address the traditional 20th century descriptive metaethics, which I should say, that's the sort of term that Gill uses in that paper I mentioned on indeterminacy and variability in metaethics. Gill says, all right, so descriptive metaethics was this task that arose. It was a sort of self-appointed task that arose in 20th century analytic metaethics of capturing the distinctive semantics of moral claims. Now, I think the emphasis on semantics was a mistake from the outset. There should always have been a greater emphasis on pragmatics. And for me, pragmatics is so damn important that the comparative lack of emphasis on it is bizarre. Personally, I'm not even sure that I would even draw a substantive conceptual distinction between pragmatics and semantics. But I think that the way that philosophers ended up addressing this thing just threw way too much. It just decontextualized things way too much. I don't want to get back on that though. But my approach to that is an empirical approach. Is yeah, we should be addressing these questions empirically. What's interesting is that Gill does not address these issues empirically. This is more of a sort of I guess you could say like a hypothesis or a theoretical proposal. But Gill is quite clear that empirical findings are relevant to what's being stated in that paper because there are some references to some of the early research. So that paper was 2009. The most, I guess you could say, important work, most influential work. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the most important. The work that really sort of as a matter of historical that like got the ball rolling historically is a paper from 2008, so just a year before, from Goodwin and Darley. That was an empirical exploration of whether non-philosophers are objectivists about morality or not. And so there was really preliminary data, and that data is referenced there. So Gill seems to have regarded that as relevant. So what's bizarre about this is that this was something that took place throughout the 20th century, and wasn't until 2009 that someone's like, hey, maybe we should start looking at this. That isn't to say there wasn't earlier empirical work. There's a really cool paper, which to my knowledge, no one has taken up on the paradigm since then, from Sean Nichols. And so it's Nichols and Folds Bennett, 2003. And they take this response dependence approach to the study of metaethics. So they're like empirical study. So there were empirical works earlier than that, but they're pretty much all 21st century. There are a couple of exceptions. I don't want to get into the whole history of that though. It's like, for me, it's super duper interesting, but I'm sure the history of the study of the psychology of metaethics is a fantastically boring topic for pretty much anybody else.
But a very important one for metaethics in general, and I guess broadly more philosophy as well. I know that Helen de Cruz has some very interesting work on the psychology of theistic arguments. So the sort of underlying psychology about cause and effect and design, that kind of. She has a really good book on it. So I think I would agree with you that more of that kind of psychology of each specific discipline in philosophy needs to be examined more. Just to shift gears a little bit, I didn't list this as one of the questions. It just sort of popped in my mind as you were talking. I'm very curious because I'm sort of at the moment I'm sort of playing around with different like ideas and bringing worldviews from metaphysics. Oops, sorry, the lights have just gone off.
Yeah, I see. All the lights just went out. Take your time.
I'll be back 1 sec. So sorry about that. For those of you at home, I'm in the law lecture hall. So that's why the lights went off. What was I saying? Oh yeah, combining worldviews. So I'm very interested how like some sort of idealism would work with moral realism, because I know one of the claims of moral realism is that there are mind independent moral truths. And I'm curious as to how that would work under a idealist view where the only things that exist are minds and ideas.
Oh wow. I think someone asked me this question once, and I think I had the same reaction that I'm having now, which is that's a really interesting suggestion. So I take it the problem might be that, if you're an idealist, ultimately like everything is going to be grounded in mental substance to a certain extent. So like in what respect could the moral facts be mind independent? Yeah, so I'm not is that the concern?
Yeah, I was thinking of it in if sorry, I was thinking of it in relation to theistic idealism, because that's a worldview that I'm exploring at the moment, where there's a foundational mind, God, at the core base of reality. So I'm wondering if you took idealism, theism, and moral realism, you could get a very interesting argument for God. Maybe. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah, what would the What would the argument be? Or
It would be something like idealism is true, moral realism is true. Moral realism has to be grounded in some sort of foundational mind. Conclusion God exists. Something along the lines of that.
I see. Yeah, I was taking it to be a potential conflict between the two because
Okay.
it sounds a little strange to say moral realism is grounded in a mind because, often the concern, like moral realism just is the view that the moral facts are stance independent. They're not made true by
Oh, sorry.
stance. Uh,
I meant like maybe not moral realism, but like moral truths. Some very vague definition of that.
right. So, where you even place the like moral realism in the context of theistic morality for me is a difficult question because I don't study philosophy of religion, and those accounts sort of fall outside. So most of the sort of contemporary disputes in analytic metaethics are not theistic accounts, and as far as I could tell, there's not a whole lot of they're like basically almost completely secularized, and so the theistic accounts seem to me to not interface with that contemporary discourse very well. If you stick rigidly to a lot of the sort of standard definitions or ways of characterizing moral realism, the theistic accounts to me often look like they're not going to play very nicely with those accounts, and they might end up being sort of like technically anti-realist accounts. I don't think that theists that want to be some type of moral realist should find that terribly concerning, because the sense in which moral facts would be stance dependent on a theistic account is so radically different from the way in which they would be stance dependent on a relativist account that they shouldn't be concerned. Like, for instance, you're not going to get like the concerns people have with relativism are going to be stuff like it's arbitrary, it varies between people. You're going to have all these sort of practical issues with carrying it out, or its foundations not seeming to comport with certain sorts of philosophical norms that you might want to endorse. Whereas, if we're talking about God, and it's like this, it's a being that it has access, is like omniscient. These principles are maybe they're necessary, or there could be characteristics of these facts that, like, even if technically they depend on God's stances, they don't depend on God's stances in a way that is sort of I guess you could say like normatively or deliberatively threatening. They would be like potentially like non-arbitrary, and there might be some other features of them. So I don't know, but that my sense is that if contemporary analytic metaethics can't really square theistic accounts in a way where they really like technically count as realism, that's just an artifact of the failure of these conceptual distinctions to carve up the conceptual space, like the philosophical positions available to us, in a way that is completely satisfying. So sometimes you get these semi-orthogonal distinctions, and you're going to get these sort of awkward fits. So I guess I'm just saying, I'm not a theist or a realist, but I don't think theistic realism should worry too much about that. But then, so what I would take to be this potential issue is that the moral facts are in some sense stance dependent on God's stances. That to me is going to be an issue. But the argument that you're presenting doesn't seem like it's really interfacing with that. So maybe everything I've said is completely relevant to what you're going for.
No, that does help a lot because I've had a worry for a while that most theistic morality is probably not going to be cashed out in some sort of moral realism, at least the way that moral realism is typically defined. I like what you said, how there's the demarcations that are made in metaethics of the landscape of possible views. I think theistic morality would be one of those awkward fits. Um, yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because it was just passing through my mind. So I don't have too much else to add onto that.
I should say, another route that a lot of theists do go, and I suspect more of them will start to go this way, are teleological accounts, because they're going to be able to I think get a lot more traction out of those than they might in attempting to ground their theistic realist conceptions, if that's what they're going for. In, I guess you could say, it's a more awkward fit with some contemporary, more naturalistically inclined accounts that are either not going to have teleology or are going to struggle with it. So I think a lot of them are just going to turn to that and try to get some type of realism out of that. I'm not as familiar with those accounts, and I don't find that teleological stuff very compelling in the first place. So I'm not terribly concerned that there's this like massive block of potential positions I would find super compelling if I dug into them, because just on the face of it, they don't strike me as very compelling. So, but it is an area that I think is ripe for exploration as well.
That's very interesting. Would that be like some sort of Aristotelian naturalism that they're going for, where they think of like they try and include telos or function as part of?
Something like that, yeah. I think so. There's people that are really into that stuff that are going to be a lot more knowledgeable about just how exactly those systems work. What I can say is they are complicated, and I'm not super familiar with them. So that I think is, there's just going to be people that are going to be so much more knowledgeable about that whole approach to ethics that, like, I would say talk to some of them. What I can say just generally is that I I'm of two minds about it. One, I would almost certainly reject the underlying metaphysical assumptions behind these sorts of accounts, and so I'm not gonna like I don't think that you're gonna get much headway out of them. Like I don't think they're gonna be turn out to be true. Two, on the other hand, um, I worry about the narrowness of the way of the presuppositions that sort of filter in to the way that philosophers do their practice, like analytic philosophers. And so if people can draw on fundamentally different conceptions of how to approach morality at its foundations, I'm all in favor of that, simply to break us out of the sort of I guess you could say, foundation gridlock that I think contemporary moral philosophy is in. So, for instance, when it comes to normative ethics, I think the reintroduction and the sort of virtue theoretic renaissance in the 20th century was a massive boon to normative ethics, because the whole consequentialism deontology, even though I'm not a virtue ethicist, but the excessive emphasis on acts and principles and the total de-emphasis on character and virtue, I think, is a massive oversight. And this relates to psychology, because when human beings go about judging one another and deciding what to do, they think about things like, if you're judging another person, you're not just judging each individual action isolated from the rest, you're judging them as a person. Is that a good person? Is that a bad person? Characterological judgments are a massive part of ordinary human moral psychology, and normative psychology more generally. And when it comes to deliberation, we don't just ask, what should I do? Or what principle should I deploy in this context? We ask what kind of people we should be. And so, yeah, it worked there. I think bringing in, I guess you could say, parallel or analog considerations into meta ethics, it should absolutely be done, even if I don't like them, just to sort of break that gridlock.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard anything about the teleological considerations, but also the gridlock that you were mentioning earlier, and bringing in new views to try and somehow break that deadlock. Um, so okay, we went down a little bit of a side path there. I want to bring us back to the main show, which it's really sort of a mishmash between evolutionary considerations and moral intuitions. So I guess, what do you have any initial thoughts on how a moral anti-realist such as yourself might try and use evolution to cast doubt on moral realists?
Yeah. So I don't think that there's anything special and distinctive about evolution in particular. So the evolutionary debunking argument got super duper popular back, what, we're going on a little over maybe 15 years ago. And so this literature blew up, and everybody's concerned about the influence of evolution. But for me, evolutionary debunking arguments are one type of genealogical debunking argument. And the general idea is that if we can give an account of the origins of why, like, what caused you to form this belief, that raise questions about whether the belief forming processes that led you to have that belief were truth tracking, like they were responsive to the truth, then that undermines your justification for the belief. So these are going to be this is like a sort of broad category of that would promote a kind of skepticism about the beliefs in question. So it's an epistemic critique. These rose on the scene, and there's a whole lot to say about them. But I don't know that I'm overly concerned with evolutionary influences in particular. So that's the first thing I would say about that. Can you give me 1 second? I got an email with an urgent request, so I need to figure out what's going on with that.
That's
Can you give
fine.
me a
No,
second?
go for it. I'll just pause the recording.
Sorry.
Okay, we're back. Sorry about that, everybody. We had a slight interruption, but we're back at it. So I think we were talking about evolution, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah, evolutionary debunking arguments. And I was just making a general point that I don't think that there's anything special about evolution when it comes to genealogical debunking arguments. And I guess the other thing I would just say is, as long as you can offer some kind of defeater that is grounded in a genealogical account of why a person has come to have the beliefs that they do, in a way that can account for those beliefs, where like the true, like the fact that the facts that would make those beliefs true are not what's causing them to have those beliefs, then you have undermined those beliefs. And I think that could be achieved with, I guess you could say, like a psychological or a cultural debunking argument. There's nothing special about evolution. That doesn't mean evolution isn't potentially relevant, but I don't know where you want to take that, or if there's something more specific you want to ask me about that.
So I guess I'm thinking of it more in terms of how it relates to our intuitions, because I feel like, I think, and I think this is also true in philosophy of religion as well, that the belief comes first and then the reasons follow. So I'm wondering to what extent our intuitions play a role in our belief formation, and whether evolutionary considerations undermine our confidence in those inferences.
So again, I don't know that I'm overly concerned with evolution in particular. What I would say is, our when it comes to the formation of any of our beliefs about anything, the genealogy of those beliefs is going to be relevant from my point of view. I think it's going to be relevant to whether or not we ultimately endorse the content of those views. So, Kane B has an example of how, like, a clear case of where a genealogical account can undermine a belief. And I'll give a similar example. So it's not the same example, but it's one that has enough similarities where it's like clear why this would be an issue. Imagine you ran into somebody and you ask them if they saw a new movie that came out, and they said, "Oh yeah, I saw the movie." And you said, "Okay, well, tell me about the movie." And they start telling you about the plot and what they liked about it and all this other sort of stuff. Then another friend shows up and says, "Hey, were you going to the movie?" And they're like, they got really awkward, and then you realize they lied. They hadn't seen the movie at all. They don't know anything about the movie. They don't know what the plot is. They don't know anything in it. Now that you know that, are you going to believe that their description of the movie was accurate? Of course not. The conclusion to be they made it up, right? So the problem is that, like, if you know why a person said the sorts of things that they said, you can come to discover that what caused them to say those sorts of things is unrelated to the truth about those things. It was not the facts of the movie that, they watched the movie, they learned about what the content, and then they relayed that to you, because now as a matter of historical fact, that didn't happen. And so this, if you know about why someone is saying the things that they're saying, it can be relevant, on these sort of causal grounds. But there's going to be these normative considerations, even if they're fairly trivial ones, like they didn't actually see the movie. And if you didn't observe something and then you're reporting that you observed it, it's not a reliable belief forming process to just make shit up. So the norms involved might be fairly trivial, but they're still going to enter into their in some way. Maybe you just believe whatever a person makes up must be true. So the point would just be that it's not merely the fact that you can give a causal account of why someone believed what they believed. There are going to be additional considerations, but in this case, it's fairly straightforward why most of us would be like, yeah, okay, so I'm not going to believe that. The question then is, when it comes to the formation of a person's judgments, like murder is wrong, or stealing is wrong, or torturing babies is wrong, why do they think that? And one reason why they might think that is that their judgments, their evaluative judgments, are saturated in evolutionary considerations. That if you go back down the sort of historical trajectory of the causal factors that led them to forming those beliefs, that their evaluative attitudes and preferences and standards are in some way substantially influenced by selective pressures, evolutionary pressures that favored the construction of a human brain, that were responsive to things that enhanced reproductive fitness, but those factors were not related to tracking moral facts. They were just tracking whatever facts would enhance reproductive fitness. So, Sharon Street has the most prominent account of of evolutionary debunking arguments. And the idea here is that if those causal factors, those selective pressures that led to these evaluative attitudes, if they were all about enhancing reproductive fitness, which they are, it would be an extraordinary coincidence if they happened to be truth tracking. And so I think she gives the example of like if you set course on a boat and you wanted to get to Bermuda, it would be a little weird to just sort of like randomly pick a direction or just and let the wind blow you wherever it blows and just let nature take its course. Like you don't actively take a role in directing yourself there, and you just let the world take you where it will. If you happen to get to Bermuda, that would be extraordinary. It'd be a super duper coincidence. And the same idea here is like basically we know the moral facts, if they were out there, would have to be in some sort of conceptual direction from our initial starting point. And if you just spun a dial and let it, an arrow point randomly in any particular direction, it'd be extremely unlikely for it to happen to land on exactly that point that led you to the moral facts. So the concern there is just that these evolutionary influences could lead us astray. They basically our way of our belief forming processes are so their initial starting point is sort of corrupted by non-truth tracking considerations. And because it's so foundational to our way of thinking, this is in a certain sense like inescapable. So that would be the idea behind that. But the thing is, like, let's say that wasn't the case. It could nevertheless be the case that non-truth tracking influences entered into the mix at some later point. So let's just say we set aside evolutionary considerations and people, I don't think this is true, but let's just suppose that there were no evolutionary influences on the content or evaluative attitudes. Okay, well, even if that was the case, it could still be that the process of enculturation, we happen as a legacy of the particular culture we're enculturated into, go about forming our evaluative attitudes in a non-truth tracking way. It could be that cultures arose in ways where the culture, like how did the culture, like what selective pressures led the culture to having the content that it has? It could be that the content of the culture is fitness enhancing, but it could be that it's serving the fitness of the culture itself. Maybe cultures are themselves self-perpetuating. It doesn't really matter so long as once we know about the causal history of what caused you to be enculturated in that particular way, if those processes are not truth tracking, then it would serve a similarly undermining role. And so again, it's not like evolution isn't the only way to debunk, to give a genealogical debunking argument. Culture can do it. We could also discover how particular psychological processes function. And it could be that if we understand the like actual way that the brain processes information, we can come to recognize that it's not doing so in a true tracking way. So, the way eyes work, when you know about the physiology of eyes, that they take in light, that they process light, and that we then utilize that information, we can give a pretty good account of how we are obtaining actual veridical like information about what the world around us is like. So is vision perfectly accurate? No, but it doesn't have to be perfectly accurate to still give us like factual information about what the world is like. But if we found certain regions of the brain or certain mechanisms in the brain that are intertwined with and embedded in the way that we make moral judgments, and we understand that they are not truth tracking systems, that those systems do things like you have a system that is activated to alleviate guilt, or activated to minimize fear, or activated with the goal of signaling how great of a cooperator you would be to social partners, independent of whether you in fact are a good cooperator. It's more like this like reputation management system. If we understood that those systems functioned in those ways, we might ask, okay, well, is a system designed to optimize for reputation management? Like the goal of the system is to produce things that you say and think and do. The function of that system is keep as good of a reputation as possible. Is that going to be a reliable truth tracking system for forming true moral beliefs? I doubt it. Probably not. So, even if you entirely set aside evolutionary considerations, you're still going to have to ask these questions, because the about like our judgments and our actions and our behavior and our moral conclusions. What from all the beginnings of the universe until the present, what causal factors influence those judgments, and is there any point at which the actual facts, if there are such facts, enter into the mix and are actually driving us towards those facts? And if the answer is no, then moral truth is going to be undermined, at least epistemically. Maybe there are moral facts and we just have no way of reaching them.
Right. I like how you drew a wider debunking argument. So it's not just that our psychological intuitions were influenced millions of years ago. They're still being influenced through culture and psychological processes that are happening even now. Like even the influence of technology could have that shaping influence. I'm curious as to whether some sort of determinism would, I guess, if we are completely determined, so if the past and everything, all the causal history of the past completely determines the future, and in particular our mental states, would that exclude moral truth at all, or our knowledge
I
of
don't
moral?
think so. No, I don't think determinism is going to be a threat here, because determinism would just mean that like all whatever given set of future events are like necessarily occur on the basis of some antecedent set of conditions. Like given these conditions will occur. So still within that framework, you're going to have like cognitive systems are either going to be truth tracking or not. So you take I create two AIs, and one of them picks up accurate information about the world and forms an accurate model, and it operates under deterministic principles, and the other it's got bugs in the system and it forms inaccurately. Okay, well, even if they're both determined, one is still has a truth tracking system and one doesn't. So determinism is just not going to be a threat to moral realism, at least in this respect. If someone thinks like you need a certain kind of free will and we don't have it because of determinism, then on that view, there might be an issue. But I don't think this is like a general issue here.
Okay, so even if we are determined, the cognitive mechanisms could still be truth tracking. It's just they wouldn't have any say in it. That
Yeah,
makes sense.
depending on what you mean by a say. Like
Right.
sometimes people will say when it comes to this is getting a little off course, but
Yeah.
that's cool. That's what happens with philosophical conversations. Sometimes people will say if like determinism is true, people don't make choices, but I just find that really weird. I would say that people make choices. It's just that the like whatever physical facts are involved in the cognitive features, like the cognitive processes involved, like there is going to be a particular, like if you knew all the facts, you would be able to predict what decision the person's going to make, but they're still making a decision. They are still deliberating about different sorts of outcomes, even if the decision that they end up making is predictable in principle. Now, some people that favor libertarian conceptions of free will might balk at that and think that something is lost. And that's fine. Maybe there is, but I don't think people should underestimate what kinds of resources are available with respect to agency, deliberation, and decision making within a deterministic conception of how cognition or agency more generally works. It's going to have a lot of resources for instance, it's not like if determinism is true, people just make random decisions. That would be really weird. I don't think philosophers typically think this, but a person that is new to the topic might think that like they might, among other things, conflate determinism with fatalism and think that, if determinism is true, you like either you will get breakfast or not. So you could just sit in your chair and then, if you'll either get breakfast or not. Well, if you make the decision to sit in your chair, you're not get up to go get breakfast, you are not going to get breakfast. So it's not the case that there's some particular outcome that if determinism is true will inevitably happen independent of the conditions that lead to it. No, it's rather it's about a sort of relation between one given set of facts and some other set of facts. These facts, if these occur, these will occur. If these occur, then these will occur. But there's still an open question about what the initial set of facts are, and different facts would lead to different outcomes. So it's not like there's an endpoint where if determinism is true, no matter what happens, you will arrive at that endpoint. It's not that. So people might think that if they conflate the two, agency is like it's not efficacious, it's not relevant. There's no reason for you to deliberate about whether you should go left or go right, because you will simply go whichever way. Like if you were fated to go right, you will go right no matter the content of your deliberation. That doesn't make any sense on a deterministic view where you're still an agent, because if you deliberate and decide to go left, and then you go left, you clearly didn't go right. So the deliberation there is still, it's still part of the causal stream. So if the causal stream is necessitating the outcomes, it's not like you can just exempt that deliberation that you engaged in where you opted to go left from that and say, nope, you're going to go right, even if you decided to go left and went left. That what doesn't make sense. So yeah, that's, but again, I don't think that's something philosophers typically mix up. But that I think is something more, I don't know that I would say non-philosophers are like going around mixed up about these things. But if you're kind of in that intermediate stage where you're getting into philosophy, I think that that kind of conflation can sometimes occur.
Okay, that makes sense. I was just thinking of it in terms of if you could give a complete causal account of why we form the beliefs that we have. In my mind, somehow that connected with determinism. I guess
Mhm.
just going back to, because I heard you say about function and the functional role of evolutionary, like selective forces and cultural influences and that kind of thing. Could a moral realist say that yes, those forces are play a major role in shaping our beliefs, but some sort of like the byproduct of that is that we gain access to moral truths. Is that
Yeah, they can and they do. So I think Kopp makes this move and Enoch makes this move. I think in different sorts of ways. But so maybe they do different things. Yeah. So one way of addressing this question is to just say like one thing you could do is just say it's not a coincidence, right? Like so you could say that natural selection did favor a truth tracking system, and so you could point to the content of our moral judgments and say actually we are tracking the truth with the way that we go about making moral decisions. um, I don't. I mean, that's one approach that's going to have its own set of problems. Street already anticipates this and has a reply to it. Street kind of says something like, "Look, the only way you're going to be able to evaluate, whether this moral claim is true rather than that one is this sort of you're going to be operating within the framework of the very cognitive system designed by those evolutionary influences in the first place, and so you can't really step outside of that and take an outside view." And so you're going to have problems with arriving at those sorts of conclusions. But a different sort of approach would be this sort of byproduct approach. So it could be something like um, okay, so the 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 factors that are influencing our moral evaluative judgments, they may have evolved to facilitate, say, cooperation or something like that. But as a byproduct, we happen to get the moral truth. Now, there's nothing conceptually wrong with that, like from a basic evolutionary perspective. So lots of like facts about human physiology and human behavior are going to be true. Like it's true that they are a product of evolution, even though natural selection didn't select for those particular traits. So I think the example, so Kane B discusses this example would be, did natural selection favor our blood being red? Well, no, it favored us having a certain sort of like biochemistry, because the particular constitution of our blood was adaptive. And then as a byproduct, our blood is red. So someone could argue that, even if there wasn't direct selection for moral truth, like natural selection favored tracking truth, that what it did favor, you could say sort of serendipitously, is it's like maybe itself something close to or approximately or in and of itself good. And maybe that gets us part of the way towards arriving at the moral truth without evolutionary influences being too much of a corrupting or like unacceptable influence. I don't know if either of those types of approaches are really going to get you all the way. I think the question is going to come down to, and I think this is a point that Fitzpatrick stresses, the degree to which moral reasoning and reflection can be rendered autonomous from those evolutionary influences. And if it can be rendered sufficiently autonomous such that we go about revising, reforming, and deliberating about the contents of our our moral values and standards, such that we update and revise them in response to philosophical considerations that are truth tracking, then we can sort of reach, you could say, like a philosophical escape velocity from those evolutionary influences, break outside those influences, and reform our beliefs in a truth tracking way. And the comparison that Fitzpatrick points to is just that why should we think that morality is so confined and like just sort of ineluctably bound to evolutionary influences on its contents, when we don't think this about art like a scientific view. So take, for instance, we have an evolved tendency to make certain sorts of judgments in a more general sense about what the world around us is like, or judgments about physics and space and properties and all those sorts of things. Are we stuck incapable of tracking truths that fall outside the scope of like our knowledge, like a sort of a folk physics or folk biology? Not at all. We use the tools of science to figure out, like, things about like quantum physics or general relativity. And those facts in many cases are highly counterintuitive. They don't look anything like what we might have thought is the case, but we develop tools as a matter of cultural practice that can sort of latch onto these the facts of the world, and then we build from there. So why couldn't we do this with respect to morality in principle? Why couldn't we discover and develop certain philosophical tools and practices that would allow us to form similarly truth tracking systems that can sort of escape the bounds of these evolved influences? So it's just going to be a question of whether or not there's like sufficient autonomy. Now, this is going to be an issue where the devil is going to be in the details, right? So for me, in the case of the sciences, we have what I would tend to say is a type of a public verification or public corroboration. Scientific facts about how like a bridge works or how chemistry works, like you could test it, you get feedback from the world itself. In the case of our moral judgments, though, I personally am skeptical that there's anything like that you can get the world to corroborate your views, where the world says, no, if you add this chemical to that chemical, it will not combust. No matter how much you believe it, you can do it and it doesn't happen. Whereas when it comes to a lot of any views that fall outside the scope of empirical inquiry, what is the final arbiter, the final check? It's not the world itself, it's us. You have that, if we are the measure of what has succeeded, then it's not clear to me that you do escape from those strictures, or at least if you do, I don't know how we would know that you do. So I do think that a more sort of armchair approach that doesn't ground, if it's dealing with a type of fact that by its very nature isn't amenable to empirical inquiry, I think you're going to face a really, really challenging problem of accounting for how judgments about that particular topic don't remain vulnerable to concerns about their genealogy. But again, we're still going to have to ask the question about, well, what are the actual details of the underlying genealogy? Like, what is actually driving these judgments? And it's possible that we could discover, through some type of study of human cognition, that there's nothing like distinctive about morality that would make us question our moral judgments in particular. And that brings you to a broader issue, which is that if these debunking arguments are supposed to be about morality, but if the processes that are behind moral judgments are compromised by evolutionary influences, what about normative judgment in general? What if why not all of it being compromised, including the very epistemic judgments, the norms governing our epistemic judgments that are prompting us to make these decisions in the first place? Why is morality singled out? And so I think the answer is there's not a good reason why it should be, not necessarily, not without knowing whether it has a special genealogy that's distinct from the rest of our normative judgments and evaluations. And if it doesn't, then you actually are dealing with this is going to generalize to all normative judgments and evaluations. And then that is potentially going to land you in some significant problems. So part of the point here would just be to say, it might be that there's nothing there's nothing special about morality that singles it out for skepticism that doesn't apply to normative considerations in general. Personally, I'm okay with that, but I think a lot of other people wouldn't be. I said a lot there, so I'll pause there.
No, that was really, really good. I think in the case of someone like Kane B, he would just bite the bullet and say that we can't make any justified inferences, even in the sciences. So I think he's a constructive empiricist. I think that's his position, or some sort of anti-realism. Um, I think just to push back on your point about, you mentioned earlier that there was no verification or no way to verify that our moral beliefs correspond to the world in the same way that science can do that. I guess you kind of could, in the sense that certain ways of living and engaging in the world lead to suffering and poor consequences, and others lead to flourishing and happiness. So there kind of does seem to be a way that you can empirically test whether your beliefs are right or wrong. Does that make sense?
It does, but I'm just going to have concerns with that. So
Okay.
for me, so there are going to be facts about what practices are conducive towards human flourishing, towards if we're characterizing in terms of what increases happiness or decreases suffering, what makes those the moral facts? Like you're still so
Right.
if you want to stipulate or maintain, so like for instance, you could give an account like this: natural selection led to the development of a distinctive type of normative cognition, moral cognition. This system of cognition evolved under selective pressure to facilitate the humans to form, develop, and maintain systems that facilitate cooperation within communities, not necessarily between communities, but within communities. So if you look at human history, people are pretty good at creating structures. They still violate them, but creating structures for them to interact with one another, but they still go to war and slaughter people outside their community. So it at least looks like it's like community centric, and it's not necessarily this like fully expanded circle that encompasses all of humanity or all life, especially. So even if that's the case, okay, so now what you're dealing with, if you want to be a moral naturalist, to me, is just a set of descriptive facts. Yeah, okay, I grant that that's true. And if you want to say those are the moral facts, okay, so the moral facts are descriptive facts. If you want to try to bring in irreducible normativity or external reasons or all the sorts of stuff that non-naturalists want to bring in, I think you're either going to be completely unable to do that by your own admission, or if you want to bring that in, you're going to have massive problems that account alone isn't able to manage. And so I think a lot of naturalists are just going to, see it as a game of horseshoes, or they're like, look, I'm not hitting the non-naturalist bullseye, but I'm getting close enough. This is close enough to realism to be not for me. That's not close enough, because I get to say, okay, well, my concern is the conceptual and metaphysical stuff that I take issue with in the non-naturalist accounts. If you're just going to say, by moral fact, I mean, so like if you're an analytic naturalist, that's just going to be totally trivial to me. If you're going to give some sort of empirical account, it may not be trivial in quite the sense of just being like if you stipulate this, then there are these sorts of descriptive facts. But if you say, okay, well, no, I actually have a robust empirical account of like the evolution of this distinctive type of cognition. That's what people are doing when they say stuff like murder is wrong, is they're activating that system. And that system, it evolved to facilitate the development of cooperative norms. Okay, that's fine. It's, I could still react to those facts. Like if the naturalist says, yep, so there are these moral facts and there are facts about cooperation. I'm not making a mistake if I say, okay, well, I don't care about cooperation, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go do this other thing. So naturalism struggles to have practical oomph or authority. It's not going to tell me what I should or shouldn't do. It's just going to say, hey, there's at best, it's going to be a possibly quite interesting descriptive account of human psychology. Uh,
Right. Yeah.
okay, I'm fine with that, but that's not what I'm rejecting. So if you want to call that realism, be my guest, then I would be a realist on that account. But that's not going to trouble me overly much. So the naturalist accounts, they are going to sort of fall prey to concerns that are at least relevant to me, which is just I would consider them trivial. Now their proponents might say, but I got a realism. Okay, that's not what I'm rejecting. So you have that. So if you want to bring in the non-naturalist considerations, I don't think that kinds of accounts you describe are going to be able to do that. They're going to have to do something else. On the other hand, those accounts are going to reject some of the assumptions that I think evolutionary debunking arguments are predicated on in the first place. So a lot of this might be sort of a dialectically inert because we would have to get into more foundational and methodological assumptions about what we're doing in the first place when it comes to all these questions. So maybe evolutionary debunking arguments could convince people in a sort of dialectical gray zone between radically different underlying metaphilosophies, but in extremis, I'm not sure that they can actually do much.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I think Sam Harris tries to do something that I did there in his book, where he says that like, if you touch the stone, you feel pain. That just is wrong, and it's bad. And then we build from that. I think that's his account. I might be wrong. Um, I I I appreciate that you pointed out that the method that I was taking leads to some sort of naturalism. And correct me if I'm wrong, but naturalism, you lose the sui generis. I don't know what it's called.
Yeah.
Nature of morality and the sort of oughtness or to be doneness. It's just sort of describing the world using redefining the word realism and good and bad. Is that right?
Well, I would be careful of accusing it of redefining. I think that itself is a matter of potential contention. Sometimes philosophers will reject another person's position by saying it's revisionary or you're redefining things. So people will say this to compatibilists about free will. They'll say you're revising the conception of free will, you're changing it. And I think a compatibilist could respond by saying, no, I'm not. Like libertarians don't own the concept of free will.
Right.
I would be mindful about that. So I sometimes feel like naturalists are engaged in a bait and switch, but I don't know if that's just because I'm personally so animated by my opposition to non-naturalist accounts that if I'm arguing with someone about realism and then they're like, actually, I'm a naturalist, then I feel like I was like, well, then what's the point of us arguing? But I don't know that that's just not a historical accident. I don't know that non-naturalists have any business claiming that they owned the concept of realism in the first place, such that
Right.
naturalists are redefining it.
Right. That makes sense. Just something that popped in my mind here. Do you see any analogy between non-naturalism and sort of Platonic accounts of mathematics? Do you see any parallels between those?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be some general. There's going to be some general similarities between them. I mean, some non-naturalist realists might even consider themselves like Platonists about the moral facts. So, I mean, it's also going to be a different a matter whether you're talking about like Platonism with like a lowercase p or like Platonism with a capital P. So you're going to have the more broad Platonist accounts and then accounts that are like I'm actually endorsing like Plato's metaphysics. So yeah, you're going to have a broad range of metaphysical positions that are not attempting to account for what the world is like, at least within the respective domain that about which one is a Platonist. Again, you might have a full Platonist metaphysics, but there could be any particular domain where you say, okay, this particular domain of facts is not the sort of thing that can be accounted for by the natural sciences, and it just falls outside the scope of that. So that puts you outside the naturalist framework, and then once you're outside that framework, you may or may not be some type of Platonist about the facts in question. You don't have to be, though. You could be something else. Some non-naturalists might not want to get super metaphysically heavy at all. They might say, look, I want the most deflationary, metaphysically light account of realism I could possibly get away with, and I don't like Platonism either. And so there are people that are going to carve out that space where they're not naturalists and they're not Platonists. But yeah, generally you're going, I mean, this all comes down to perhaps a crude but major distinction that is just sort of it's still just there, which are the more empirically oriented philosophers and the less empirically oriented philosophers. I'm going to fall squarely on the more empirical side of things, which sometimes can, and of course there's bad empiricism. That I don't take that to be the most extreme form, but like I like if there was like a spectrum, I'm like very, very, very far on the empirical side, but in a way that I think is defensible. But it's not going to come out as like anti-philosophy. It's going to come out as pro-pragmatism, and that's going to put me in as kind of unusually like unusual orthogonal dimension in the way that I approach things. Pragmatists just approach things, I would say, differently rather than anti-philosophically. So this is another case where I think there's a strong conventional conception, and maybe this is part of the philosophical identity too among many analytic philosophers, of seeing their discipline as methodologically autonomous, as engaged in armchair. Maybe that sounds pejorative, but I don't intend for it to be. But a priori inquiry. I say I don't take it to be pejorative because like mathematicians don't have to run out doing experiments, and yet I think mathematics is like awesome. So I don't have any problem with that. So a lot of philosophers see that as their discipline. They're like, look, I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to break out telescopes and microscopes and beakers. That's not what I do. And what I do is important and valuable. It makes contributions. Your lights are out again.
Sorry. There we go. Sorry about that, everyone.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going off on a million tangents here,
No,
but
it's
yeah,
great.
there
Great.
are these broad outlines of conflict. If you want to see a really cool characterization that goes quite a ways back, William James talks about this in his work on pragmatism. In that it's like a series of lectures. What is it? Just the book Pragmatism? I'll look it up.
Yeah, it just the analogy between mathematics and um non-naturalism just sort of popped into my mind there. Because I see a lot of arguments in philosophy sort of they share very similar structure and very similar positions that I've started to notice much more having done metaethics and adjacent subjects. So that just popped into my mind there.
You'll see a lot of these resonances across. So it's a pragmatism in the meaning of truth. At the
Okay.
start of that, William James talks about the philosophical temperaments of the more empiricist and the more rationalistically inclined, and that's like this sort of a, again, and James is self-conscious about this and comments like you might see this as this like crass, almost like like this really crude oversimplification, but understood as it's intended to be, which is, yeah, this is an oversimplification. It's not to say everyone is this or that. It's that there does seem to be this underlying dispositional domain in which people doing philosophy, they don't have to be categorically an A or a B, but they tend to differ in their temperaments. Like my approach to addressing philosophical questions is radically unlike like humor's, and it's much more similar to like say Dennett's. And so there are these similarities. I think that the psychological landscape itself of philosophers is super duper fascinating. There hasn't been a lot of work identifying these differences, and what little work I've seen hasn't really found too many substantive, like if you look at like big five differences and other sorts of stuff, you don't find big psychological differences that correlate with people's philosophical positions, at least from the little I've seen, which surprises me. I feel like there's got to be something there. This is a case where, ironically, I'm like of the empirical mind, but then the empirical evidence doesn't support my conclusion. So I'm like, I don't believe it. But that is the case. Sometimes empirical findings could come out. Like imagine empirical findings come out and they say, it's not healthy to drink water. Like I would be like, I think I'm going to be skeptical of that. So, okay.
Yeah,
Anyway, you have stuff to say. So
I was, yeah, because I'm very interested about that as well, about like the psychological dispositions that leads one into siding more with empiricism or siding more with rationalism. And this gets to one of the last questions that I had, but we're sort of bouncing around everywhere, so I don't know what I was going to say. What so because of these varying psychological dispositions and where they lead philosophically, and then you sort of get this like World War One style bombardment of arguments back and forth, trying to get the other side to retreat or to change sides. Do you see arguments as like the analogy I just presented of just bombarding the other side, or trying to convince them, or do you think of arguments more as showing that a certain philosophical position is rational? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I'm understanding exactly where you're coming from.
I guess I guess my question is, what do you think like an argument how should we judge whether an argument is good or not? In
Oof, that
specifically
is
in
such a big
metaethics, but
question.
yeah, I know.
So, ultimately, when people are evaluating arguments, they're going to be considering a bunch of premises and some conclusion. And that conclusion, if it's not already a position they endorse, if it's already a position they endorse, you don't need an argument. They already think it. And so uh, people, like psychologically speaking, are going to have a reaction to different sorts of conclusions. Some conclusions are going to be more inconsistent with the existing web of beliefs that you currently hold. So if someone comes along and they have an argument for why they ate a sandwich yesterday, I'm not going to be like, oh my God, there's no way I could accept that conclusion. I'm going to be like, you don't need an argument. I believe you. But they're like, okay, but I have photographic evidence. And if I have photographic evidence and you have no good reason to think that it's fabricated, then I'd be like, this is way overkill for proving that you ate a sandwich. But if they said I was hanging out with Bigfoot in the woods, okay, now I'm going to want an argument because that's much more inconsistent with my beliefs. Now, if they said they have a box of square circles, we're really going to have a problem. So when I'm looking at those conclusions, I'm looking at how well do these, like, for the first one to be true, I don't have to change anything about what I think about the world. For the second one to be true, I have to change some things. And so I'm going to, expect a higher degree of evidence. And then for the third one, I'm going to have to radically change how I think about everything. And so the way that I evaluate arguments from the very outset is going to be, unfortunately, psychologically speaking, I think we kind of just work backwards and ask how much would this threaten the rest of my beliefs. Now, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. That's actually, if you have good reason for your existing set of beliefs, it, like for instance, I think it is a pretty defensible worldview that there are no square circles, but people sometimes eat sandwiches. So additional information about more people eating sandwiches is not a problem, but someone claiming to have a box of square circles is. So this is not like flawed, but there are going to be psychological factors here because the reasons why a given belief is perceived as inconsistent with or threatened to the rest of your views and the degree to which it is isn't going to be perfectly a function of how defensible that belief is or how defensible your worldview is. There's also going to be emotional factors involved in all of this. I mean, take me, for instance. I've been pushing anti-realism for a while now. If I saw an argument with a conclusion that therefore moral realism is true, and the premises look really good to me, I don't know that I go, oh, okay, well, I guess it's a really strong argument for moral realism. Maybe I'm a moral realist now. I think my reaction would be fear, surprise, concern, worry, possibly embarrassment. And I think I would immediately start going, where can I reject a premise? Where can I reject a premise? Like I would be threatened by that. Not
So,
simply because I'm not, yeah, sorry.
sorry, just to interrupt. Would you say then that ultimately the foundation of that belief in moral realism is not based on reasons and justification? It's based solely on the your inner psychology. Is that the line you're drawing?
Well, so I would think that I have good reasons, but that doesn't mean that those reasons are the sole factor influencing how I evaluate arguments to the contrary.
Do
I'm
you think
emotionally invested in not being wrong. And I think this is generally true about everybody to varying degrees about their beliefs.
do you think that one is more foundational than the other?
What what are the ones?
Sorry, sorry. Like psychological justifications and rational justifications or reasons. Does
Oh, I think it's going to vary across beliefs and vary across individuals. So I
okay.
don't think that there's going to be like one or the other is has priority in every case. I think this is going to be. I'm also not even sure it's like a zero sum. Like I'm not even sure that these are. It's like the more you have of one, the more you have of another. It could just be that like non-truth tracking factors play some role. Truth tracking factors play some, or justifying factors play some role. Who knows how much in any given case? And I don't have introspective access to that. Like I don't actually know what would I haven't seen an argument for moral realism that I thought was really really compelling. So I don't know how I would react. I might react by going, "Oh, I guess I'm a moral realist." I don't think so. I think I have biases. Now I say this not to just be like self-effacing or say, look how self-aware I am of my biases. I think everybody's biased about stuff to varying degrees. Depending on their where they are in their philosophical careers or how much they care about these sorts of things, they may be more or less susceptible to changing their mind. So I think I lost sight of the initial question, but oh, right. So I guess what I'm trying to set up here is that part of the way that we go about evaluating beliefs is with respect to the rest of our beliefs. And so you're going to have, when it comes to trying to convince people to hold your view, part of my concern about a lot of philosophical arguments is that they're very object level or surface level. It like two people arguing about whether this particular fact, philosophical position is true, or this particular fact is the case. Often they're not going to make much progress. They're not going to make much headway in a philosophical exchange about those facts because they're the reason why one of them holds one position and one of them holds the contrary position is not because of one of the other of them hasn't considered this particular argument or that particular argument that has an established pedigree in the literature. It's not like when you present the Kalam cosmological argument, you just knock down atheists like dominoes. And it's not like if you present like an argument from Mackey or an argument from Ayer or some contemporary, like a Blackburn or something like that, that you have the straightforward syllogism that realists are just going, holy shit, I guess we're anti-realists now. No one has this reaction. And when you see realists and anti-realists have discussions and debates at a conference or videos like this, it doesn't look like the arguments are doing any work. No one is moved by this. They're already familiar with one another's arguments. They read one another's work. It looks like a choreographed dance where everyone's taking swings and nobody's landing punches. So I don't think anyone's moved by these arguments that it's actually working in the field. I think that the differences are more foundational. They're more metaphilosophical. They're more methodological. They're more dispositional. And so, yeah, I don't think these arguments are doing much of anything. And I think that if philosophers really wanted to get stuff done, they would be, at least for now, shifting almost all of their focus towards more fundamental questions about metaphilosophy, methods. What are intuitions? How do they work? How much stock should we put in them? Which one should we put stock in, under what circumstances, and why? They would be asking questions like that. They would be asking questions about how do we even address and resolve these questions in the first place? And unless and until we can reach some rough agreement on that, all of the surface level questions we're dealing with, it's like fencing with rubber swords. It's a complete waste of time. And so, I see so much of the philosophical literature as just a goofy fluff of just bumping up one semi-articulated, ambiguous idea grounded in a bunch of presuppositions the other person probably doesn't share, bumping up against the other person's unfounded presuppositions. None of them are being made explicit. It's like seeing two syllogisms where there are suppressed premises for the conclusions of contrary arguments that themselves are based on suppressed premises, all the way back 8 arguments in both directions. How are they possibly going to agree at an argument eight points downstream if they don't agree on the previous 8 points? And so that's what it looks like to me. I also should say, I think it's pretty obviously that's the case with the current state of analytic philosophy. And so given that I think that is the case, and that it's pretty clearly the case, and that I think analytic philosophers doing this work, this should be apparent to them. Either it is apparent and they're not really doing the work of resolving things, which would be bad, or it's not apparent to them, and then they're somehow remarkably oblivious to the failure to really grapple with the deeper issues. Both of those are bad. So I see a lot of contemporary debates in analytic philosophy as a catastrophic waste of time. And so I then have to ask the question, this is like a lesson you might get from Dennett, which is to say, if you see something happening, you got to ask, like, whose interest does it serve? What is it good for? What's it doing? Take that see evolution and natural selection as this universal asset and apply it to this case. If philosophers are engaged in a bunch of disputes and it really, really, really looks like those disputes are a big waste of time, you got to ask the question, okay, so they're probably not then actually trying to resolve the dispute. So what are they really doing? And unfortunately, I have an incredibly pessimistic attitude, which is that philosophers are largely engaged in this as a matter of institutional inertia. I think that they just get inducted into philosophy. Philosophy's methods are not very good at resolving these problems, and they're just continuing to grind the mill of producing papers that aren't really getting anything done. And the second is, I think a big part of it is signaling. So I think a lot of what philosophical work is directed towards is people showing off how clever they're capable of being in their work. And a third part of it is recreation. I think philosophers do this because they enjoy doing it. And, combine all of those with, hey, if we actually did dig into the underlying methods and presuppositions behind what we're doing, maybe it's going to turn out like Wittgenstein is right. And we are catastrophically wasting our time here. It's a bunch of what we're doing is a bunch of nonsense. I think a lot, maybe, I don't know how many, but I think a lot of philosophers might be worried about that. And they don't want to look too closely. They don't want to open up the basement, look what's down there, because they would find that they've been wasting their time. And if you spent decades invested in this enterprise, you probably don't want to think that you're engaged in pointless recreation. You want to think you're getting something done. And if you're not, that's not a very pleasant conclusion to reach. So yeah, overall, I think I'm quite pessimistic. I should say, as a caveat to that, I am absolutely not saying all contemporary analytic philosophy is a big waste of time. I think that these are pockets of where particular literatures have gone, where I think at least some of the discussions within those literatures are a big waste of time. I think like Gettier problems are a big waste of time. Probably a lot of epistemologists agree with that, but the literature started to move on and people work in other areas. So I think there's undoubtedly lots of really, really valuable philosophy going on. There's going to be stuff in philosophy of science and various areas of philosophy that I think are super valuable. So I'm not saying all analytic philosophy is bad. I'm saying there are big blotches of unproductive discussions. I think a lot of analytic philosophers that would disagree with me about almost everything would still maybe at least agree with that. Okay.
Cool. One of the takeaways I got from that was that something along the lines that an argument's strength should be judged by its dialectical force against someone who doesn't believe that. And because I'm just sort of summarizing what you said, because just to get it all clear in my mind, that we've got to go back to a bit like Descartes, back to these sort of first principles and methods, and then build philosophy from there. Is that roughly what you said?
Yeah. So I want to ask the question, not what's true, but what are our goals? What are we trying to do? I think the solution to a lot of this stuff, we didn't get as much into evolutionary debunking arguments as I wanted to myself. I know initially I was like, hey, I don't, which is ironic because I'm like, I don't specialize in this. But there's some really cool stuff. So one point I want to make about that is that there's a really cool paper it's just called very unhelpfully Evolution of Morality by Mashry and Mallon. And what they argue in that paper is, I'll try to make this relevant. What they argue is that the claim that morality evolved can be disambiguated in at least three ways: that is, special capacity for distinctively moral cognition evolved, that normative cognition in general evolved, or that some of the components involved in moral judgment evolved. And they argue that the idea of a distinctive capacity evolved, it's not well supported by the evidence. The other two are probably true. So that, I mean, one, I think that shows that one of the issues with evolutionary debunking arguments is that empirical considerations are relevant and they're understudied by the philosophers engaging in these arguments. So philosophers will often pick up some degree of empirical considerations and run with them, but often they don't dig into the details. So if we do dig into the details, I think we'll find that there's a lot there that could influence how we proceed downstream of that. And so I really just think philosophers need, depending on what they're doing, more grounding in the empirical fields that are relevant to their lines of inquiry. So I think psychology, I don't know how to do moral philosophy well, depending on precisely what you're doing. Like if you're doing history of moral philosophy, that's whatever. But like psychology is just going to be super important. So the issue with that is that if normative cognition in general is threatened, then I think we're going to need to start really digging into the details and pulling things apart. And I'm already losing track of what were initially you were asking about.
I think I was just summarizing what you said earlier. Just on this, I'm curious, what do you think are those methods and tools that philosophers ought to be using when applying it to just more the questions in philosophy that sort of branch off from them, if that makes sense? So what do you think those tools and methods should be? How should philosophy start? And then how can we apply that to metaethical questions, metaphysical questions, philosophy of science, et cetera, et cetera?
Right. Oh, and now I remember where I was going with this too, and they're both sort of intertwined. So with respect to the point I was making, and I'll bring it back to this, which is that if all of our normative considerations, all of our evaluative judgments are threatened by evolution or culture or whatever, um, I'm okay with that because I'm not a normative realist in any respect. So I just don't endorse normative realism at all. And I'm not overly concerned with whether or not our judgments are tracking truths, because that's just not what, when I'm going about reasoning, deliberating, and forming views, I'm not in the business of thinking that there are truths out there, and then my job is to like latch onto them through some inscrutable means, whether it's empirically or in some a prioristic way. Instead, for me, and this relates back to what I'm saying, we need to get to the fundamental question of like, what are we trying to do, like foundationally, because I think that will orient everything that follows in terms of the methods. And for me, what I'm trying to do is live a good life. It's to achieve my goals. It's to get the things I want. It's ultimately to succeed. And so if we all started with that as our foundation, I think that it's pretty easy to see how a lot of the concerns that might trouble philosophers about whether evolution or any genealogical account threatens our ability to track truth, or how we face all these methodological problems. A lot of those problems dissolve when we orient our approach to philosophy through a pragmatic lens, when our goal is practical success rather than the sort of the many of the sort of conventional things, like the sort of more robust truth correspondent respects in which philosophers approach what they're doing. If we recognize a lot of that as if we just set aside those questions, like the question of whether those positions are defensible or true or whatever, as just useless. Like, look, like this is something that happens with Gettier problems. Like, and this sort of general approach you see in analytic epistemology. Let's just say someone could give you the correct account of what knowledge is. So it's justified true belief plus X. And there's various sorts of accounts of what that X is. Let's say they gave you that account. So what do you ultimately end up with an account of? As far as I could tell, you end up with an account of how English speakers use a particular word. I don't. So now what? What do I do with that? The answer is nothing. I don't care that much about how English speakers use a word. If I'm really, really interested in linguistics, that might be an interesting like piece of trivia, but it has no direct practical relevance. When I go about forming beliefs, I don't go like, oh, well, I know these things and I don't know those things, and I only act on what I know. So, haha. I act like the facts about how I go about deliberating and making decisions are subordinate to my goals. And so I'm only going to favor, practically speaking, a pragmatic conception of knowledge. Like to the extent that some things that I believe are actionable and some things aren't, I want to use whichever system is most that will achieve my goals most efficaciously. That approach is not going to be subordinate in principle to however it is English speakers use the word knowledge. So I just don't care. If it happens to align with my goals and belief forming practices, fine. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So this is just a long way of me saying, I think philosophers should just be pragmatists. And I think if philosophers got on board with this sort of pragmatist approach to philosophy, most of the metaphysical speculation would dissolve overnight, and many of the methodological issues would just go away. And I think that philosophy would end up being immediately a much more valuable, productive, and useful enterprise, where when we go about building our models and forming accounts and deliberating about things, we're ultimately oriented towards, at the end of the day, how will our considerations in this particular domain, the beliefs we end up forming, the positions we end up adopting, ratchet into the rest of our belief forming positions and framework and worldview in a way that will ultimately contribute to making things better for us and achieving what we want to achieve. I think a lot of philosophers would hate that approach. I think for many of them, it would seem like an abdication of the pursuit of actual truth and instead would reorient us towards this like crass expedience, something like that. And I don't think that that's the case. And I think that's largely based on a misunderstanding of the robustness of what a pragmatic account of truth and of philosophy more generally can actually achieve.
Okay. Okay. Could you on your pragmatist approach to philosophy, would you be able to read off of that philosophical labels in other disciplines, like in philosophy of science? You'd be like an anti-realist. You wouldn't be concerned with the truth of a scientific theory, but its sort of practical utility. Does that is that can you read that off of your pragmatist philosophy?
Sort of, yeah. You have to be really careful about what you take like an anti-realist position to be. So when it comes to like meta-ethical disputes, just to be on like home turf, I don't think that there are stance independent moral facts, but more fundamentally, I think that the entire way in which the dispute is framed is itself so conceptually and methodologically flawed that I would prefer to like jettison the entire discussion of that. And so, in a certain sense, like really, I'm a quietist about it. I think this is not an issue worth discussing or addressing at all. But if someone says, take a stance on the metaphysics of this, like, is there this sort of thing? The answer is no. In that sense, if you want to call me an anti-realist, like a scientific anti-realist, fine. Like I guess I'm a scientific anti-realist. But in a certain sense, I think that a lot of those labels, the vast majority of the people disputing those labels and adopting those labels are operating within the very frameworks that I'm rejecting foundationally.
Right. That makes sense. So the whole architecture of the dialectic in not just metaethics, but philosophy of science, metaphysics, the whole, just the way that it's structured, you would reject and you think it's just a complete waste of time. Was that right?
Yeah, I would say that there are salvageable elements of a great deal of philosophy. Philosophy of science, I'm probably going to have the least issue with, but yeah, like I don't think a lot of these distinctions are completely irrelevant or useless or pointless. So, for instance, just to take an example where I'm not even that invested in it, but like motivational internalism versus externalism, whether or not to believe a proposition to be true carries with it, like it's a feature of the belief that there's going to be some necessary motivation accompanying that. I don't. That's not a useless question to ask. It could be that if you believe something, you're motivated to act on it, or maybe not. I would want to ask a bunch of empirical questions about how agency works, and I think a lot of like sort of analytic questions are going to be a complete waste of time because you could just stipulate you could talk about intrinsically motivating beliefs or necessarily motivating beliefs and non-necessarily motivating beliefs. And you could just say, okay, the former is any instance in which an agent endorses a proposition in such a way so that this is accompanied by some motivation to comply with the whatever facts are entailed with the proposition, whatever. And then in the other case, not. Now, someone could say, but the second one's not a belief. Okay, then belief sub one, belief sub two. Who cares? Like, like a lot of times I think that these disputes are just turn into empty verbalistic disputes. So there is a framing of that dispute that is probably a big waste of time. But I think that there is a sense in which one could extract the salvageable, relevant, like you could take some feature of that, import it over into empirical considerations, and ask a question like, hey, when people believe stuff, is that best construed as them being motivated or not? Like in other words, you could sort of get a sort of pragmatic analog to, or an empirical analog to a lot of the distinctions, and salvage them in a way that I think could do work.
Okay. I think that also answers one of the questions that I had for you, which was, do you think that most terms and concepts in analytic philosophy are vacuous? I think you've quite clearly answered that one. I'm curious, what parts of, because you mentioned philosophy of science, is there anything in metaethics and the distinctions that are made and the concepts that are used? Are there any in particular that you think are salvageable or worth salvaging?
Yeah. So I like internalism and externalism falls within metaethics. So that would be there'd be elements of that I think are salvageable. I also think it's an important feature of understanding human moral psychology to know if and when there are instances in which people, for instance, might co-opt propositional language for, say, rhetorical purposes. So, example I frequently give is, you have a kid that wants to go to a party, their parents say no, and they try to sneak out to go to the party, and the parents catch them and they say, you will not go to that party. Now, grammatically, that's like structured as a proposition, but in that context, it's best understood, I think, as an imperative. Don't go to the party. They're not like making a prediction about the future. They're telling the kid, don't go. You're issuing a command. And so there are clearly and I don't think that that's so out of accord with natural language, like natural English language, that that's never happened. So in other words, I think people have actually used seemingly propositional language to convey non-propositional content. Um, the question is, how often do they do that in morality and like with respect to moral claims? I don't know. That's an empirical question. So I think there you have, this is an instance of, you have an analog to non-cognitivism. You get something like Hare's account of like universal imperatives or something like that. So and again, is this going to be identical to what Hare had in mind? I don't know, probably not, but there is still an interesting question about to what extent and how often do people use seeming like structurally propositional moral claims to issue moral imperatives or to express emotional attitudes without propositional content. That to me is a meaningful question. You could go out and do a study on that, and I see no reason to purge that from our understanding of the world. And so you have these distinctions in metaethics that I think are perfectly fine when understood in contexts that I would regard as like amenable to some type of like actual inquiry, rather than it being some sort of I think vacuous armchair analysis.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm seeing if okay, there's one other thing that I wanted to bring up, and then I think we'll end with just some quick questions in philosophy of religion that I have a weird curiosity about. So I know you made a video on this, and I'm curious if you've changed at all on how you would respond to, say, a moral realist arguing, well, look, look at the Phil Paper survey, whatever the percent is, 60, 70% of philosophers are moral realists. Probably moral realism is true and moral anti-realism is false. So how would you respond to that kind of argument?
So I do have it's my longest blog series. It's a 9-part blog series where I respond to this type of concern. The first thing I should say is that typically when I've seen people make that sort of claim, it's not professional philosophers. I haven't heard too many professional philosophers say, because most contemporary analytic philosophers are moral realists, therefore moral realism is probably true. They'll sometimes make claims like kind of like that. Like they'll say, look, the fact that the majority of experts endorse moral realism is some evidence for realism. That I think is like clearly true, but that doesn't mean that much. So I'm going to take a Bayesian approach to pretty much anything. So anybody believing anything is evidence that it's true. It's just a question of how much. So the fact that some people believe in Bigfoot is evidence of Bigfoot. It's not great evidence, but it's some evidence. Now, I'm not saying that philosophers stand in relation to realism in the same way that random people believing in Bigfoot stand in relation to Bigfoot. But just the point is, a world in which nobody believed in Bigfoot is like less likely if Bigfoot is real than a world in which some people do. So you compare those two worlds, and I'm in the one where they do. So that's some evidence of Bigfoot. So then the question is, so first, the fact that most contemporary analytic philosophers appear to endorse moral realism, that is some evidence that realism is true. Now, it's just a question of, is it like how strong? And I think the answer is it's pretty weak evidence. It's not nothing. Now, I don't know how to quantify it. Like I can't say it's 12 units of evidence. So then we could say, okay, well, what makes it weak evidence? Like, why don't I find that super duper compelling? So the first thing I would say is that in any instance in which a person is an outsider to a field, a good heuristic is to trust expert consensus within that field. So I don't study climatology, but the fact that most climate scientists think climate change is a real thing and it's like, there's a vast majority is really good evidence climate change is real. So I I hope that doesn't get like a flag in your video, like stuff about climate science,
Oh,
because
does
they,
it do that?
I don't know. Yeah, they'll do that.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, certain topics they put like notifications. So sorry about that if they do that.
Yeah, I guess.
So like, yeah, there's other topics I could bring up. In fact, I won't mention them. Okay, so like typically, if 98% of neurologists agree that we don't have like some lobe in the brain proposed by some like weird crackpot, okay, then yeah, probably we don't have that in the brain. So you get the idea. I don't need to give a million examples. So then the question is, okay, well, are philosophers in fact experts about like whether or not moral realism is true? And I don't know. I don't think so. But ultimately, that heuristic is only valuable like to the extent that you don't have direct personal knowledge of the evidence or reasons for endorsing the belief directly. So if 100% of experts in a given field endorse a view, and then you look at the reasons and evidence that they have, and you yourself are confident that you have judged that those reasons are like no good, like you find out they all flipped a coin at the last conference and they decided they would all believe whatever the coin came up with. Okay, now you have, like, I would say decisive reason not to trust their judgment. There's like, now you'd say, okay, well, 50-50 chance that it happens to accord with the truth if it's a dichotomous issue. So just the point is there, like, you actually need to know that their own, that, like, you need to know whether the experts themselves are using truth tracking processes. And if you yourself study the topic, you can increasingly develop your own like degree of knowledge and justification for evaluating the degree to which those experts are using truth tracking systems. So when you yourself have knowledge within a field, you're in a better position to reject expert consensus than when you're outside the field. And I don't think most people would disagree with that. The other thing is to just say it would be really absurd if we say if most people think something, even if you are within the field, you got to think it, because then like whenever a position reaches critical mass of one person more than half, everyone else is compelled to follow suit. That'd be ridiculous. Sometimes the 40% position is the correct position. So there's that. And I would say in this particular issue, I am not an outsider. So to an outside perspective, it might like serve relative to their epistemic position. The fact that most people are moral realists is probably more compelling to them than it is to me. And I don't think either of us are necessarily making a mistake there. So I will say that, give the point its due. It's not useless. It's not irrelevant. But there are a number of considerations that should be kept in mind in this particular case. This would include that the current number is 62% for philosophers in general. It bumps up to 65% if you look at specialists in metaethics. However, if you look at specialists in metaethics, some things to say about the demographics of that survey. One, there are questions about how representative that survey is of philosophers in general. It's not entirely clear. I believe it's 48% people from the United States. So it's going to have this heavy, this heavy bias towards people in predominantly English-speaking countries. So the United States, UK, Australia, New Zealand are overrepresented there. So that's going to be a concern about the demographics that comprise it. I think it had 1,750 people in it. And of those, 13% are meta-ethicists, which I think was 228. I'm pretty confident about these numbers, but not super confident. That's not a ton of people. So we're not talking and I don't know how representative they are. And so you do have questions about the degree to which they're representative of philosophers, and then you have questions about the degree to which they're representative of people in general and of well-informed or knowledgeable people. So there's all these questions about how much you can generalize from those results. So for instance, when it comes to metaethics, are we counting only people that are philosophers of morality that specialize in metaethics? What about all the people that have, in the past 100 years, gone on in other disciplines? What about moral psychologists? What about anthropologists? What about sociologists, criminologists, people that work in law, people that work outside of philosophy, but nevertheless approach and understand morality from different points of view? What would happen if we surveyed all them? I bet there are going to be fewer moral realists. I don't know. And how much do we weigh the respective judgments of those people? Again, I don't know, but it's probably not zero for those people. So moral psychologists, is it zero? It doesn't count what they think? It seems a little weird. So you have that as an issue, like how are we judging who we're talking about in the first place? The other point is just 62% is just not that big of a consensus. You have, I think it's 26%, something like that are anti-realists. That's pretty good representation. Another concern is that 62% is actually a little bit misleading, because what you really have, there's another question on the 2020 field paper survey, which is whether they're naturalists or non-naturalists about the moral facts. And you get about a 50-50 split. It's slightly higher for the naturalists. And the naturalist positions are, in certain respects, radically different from the non-naturalist accounts. And in fact, in some ways, there are more resonances and similarities between the naturalist and the anti-realist accounts than there are between them and the naturalist account. And so the actual situation is super duper misleading. When I reject moral realist accounts, I tend to say that all realist accounts are trivial, false, or unintelligible. Trivial does not mean false. I don't have massive philosophical problems with naturalist accounts. I see them as kind of pointless. They're just telling me, hey, the moral facts are these descriptive facts. Okay. But I'm not going to say that I don't think they're unintelligible. They may or may not be false. My point here is that there's like a counting problem here. which is that they're lumping all the naturalists and non-naturalists in together, and non-naturalists will leverage this as though their position is in the majority. And it's not. So if you look at the actual percentage of non-naturalist realists, I believe it's 26.6%. If you look at the anti-realists, it's 26.1%. I mean, they're almost the same. So non-naturalist realists are about the same proportion as anti-realists. So that's an issue. That all the naturalists are getting lumped in with the non-naturalists, when really my major concern is with non-naturalism. So really, I've likened it sometimes before. It's closer to like a rock, paper, scissors situation than a dichotomous situation. So I think that the results are somewhat misleading in that respect. There are so many other issues. I don't think we could reasonably go into them all. So what I would recommend is like people read my work on this. Can I mention the
Yeah, yeah,
name?
go ahead.
Yeah, it's called so I have a series called the Phil Papers Fallacy. So it's based on what the survey I'm talking about is the 2020 Phil Papers. That's PHIL Papers survey. If you just Google that, you'll find the results. And one of the questions about whether you're an objectivist or not, or a real. Sorry, I think they ask realist or not about morality. And then the other question asks about your general meta-ethical position. And you could compare and contrast those. Anyway, I raise many, many issues. For me, the biggest issue behind all of this is that we need to know why realists endorse realism in the first place. And if we don't have an answer to that question, I don't think we have good reason to put that much stock in what they think. Here's a couple final points of consideration on this. Suppose it turns out that the vast majority of non-philosophers either are moral realists or would, if prompted to consider the issue, endorse moral realism. Let's say it turns out to be, just for the sake of simplicity, 100% of people. People that don't study moral philosophy are moral realists, all of them, let's just say. Now we go and look at what moral philosophers think, or people that specialize in metaethics in particular. We discover 65% of them are moral realists. Now, does that look like what we would expect if, like, moral realism is clearly and overwhelmingly true? It's not so obvious anymore, because it looks like everyone started out as realists, and 1/3 of the people that study the topic ended up becoming anti-realists. Now, what if that is simply a correction for a very strong bias in favor of realism? That might actually be taken as some pretty good reason to question whether moral realism is true. So what we really need is not what's the overall percentage of the expert view on the matter, but how much the people that are taking positions on the matter are moved by the contents of the field. Like, what if we found out like exactly the amount of people before they studied philosophy was 65%, like before they studied metaethics, and then after they studied, it's still 65%. It looks like the arguments and the content of the discipline didn't do any work to move people around. So when people look at the real number, that's a mistake. You need to look at how much that number changes in response to the arguments. So like, no one talks about that. That's goofy. Like, it's like they just don't think about basic statistical considerations, which I would say ironically raises questions about their level of expertise. So that's a concern. And the bottom line is we don't know the answer. I do want to make an important comparison here, which is that if you look at what most philosophers think, and I know this is good because you have an interest in philosophy of religion. If you survey that same survey, if you ask them about whether they're atheists or not, a big majority are atheists. I think it's around 70%. I don't remember the exact number, but it's larger than the number of realists, I believe. Now, if you and you could do this, and there's like tabs to look at filter the results by specialization. What do you think you find when you filter by people that specialize in philosophy of religion? Do you know the answer?
Yeah, it's mostly theists.
It's mostly theists. It completely flips. So it goes from something like approximately 70% atheists, 30% theists. It's not simple because people pick other and other stuff. And it completely flips. It's like 30-70. So should we take that as compelling evidence that theism is true, or like at least strong evidence? Well, maybe, but it depends how much specialists in philosophy of religion were moved by the arguments for and against theism.
Right.
And it's completely reasonable to think that there are massive selection effects going on. That is, selection effects are effects where the proportions that you see or the outcomes that you see are driven by whatever factors led you to like pull people into that category of evaluation in the first place. What I mean by that is that if most of the people that choose to become specialists in philosophy of religion were theists from the outset, it should come as no surprise if a much larger proportion of them are theists than philosophers in general or people in general or whatever. And so the point just there is that it's not the quality of the arguments for theism. I mean, it could be that are causing them to be theists. It's that they were already theists to begin with, and the arguments aren't really doing any work. The same thing applies to philosophy, I think, in general, which is that if the kinds of people that become philosophers and that pursue metaethics, either one, are dispositionally inclined at the outset of inquiry to be moral realists, it's not that surprising that the slight majority of them are moral realists. That does not show that we have good reason to be moral realists. What we need to know is how good are their arguments, and that is where it's the outsider perspective, I think, starts to look rather weak. So you're relying on this heuristic. Most experts think this. Okay, well, you don't know anything about the arguments, but if you do know about the arguments, then you are in a position to judge them. So how much should I weigh the mere fact that colleagues and peers, a slight majority, favor the position over my ability to judge and like weigh the contents of arguments after extended study? Well, if I don't weigh the latter quite highly, I'm not in a good epistemic position more generally, and I do weigh it quite highly. I don't think I'm terrible at evaluating these arguments. And my estimation of the arguments is that they are one and all terrible. They're completely unconvincing. And so when I look at that, what it leads me to think is, sure, it's some evidence for realism, but I actually think it's better evidence that meta-ethicists are not super responsive to the quality of the arguments. Now, why that is a separate question. So I raise actually more issues than that. But I guess I'll just stop there because I raised so many of them.
No, that was really, really good. I know that Helen de Cruz, just to plug someone else, I think I mentioned her before, but she's done quite a lot of work on why most philosophers of religion are theists. And you're right, it is selection effects, and they were already theists and they went into it. So shocking. I just to go back to the start, just to add something there, I think even if, let's say there's like a philosophical position where it's like 99% and for it and 1% against it, I think that even then that doesn't say anything, because unless the facts have changed. Because I know that idealism back, 100, 200 years ago used to be a very dominant position, and then it sort of fell away, and now it's sort of coming back. But the arguments for it haven't really changed. The philosophy is the same. It's just times have changed, different cultural effects have changed the way that philosophers approach things. So I just wanted to flag that as well.
Yeah, that is something I mentioned in the series, is that I suspect that the current proportion of philosophers at any given time that endorse or reject a position may be driven by sociological forces that are, not truth tracking. So, at the start of the 20th century and on probably up until about the mid 20th century, it's likely, although we don't have, high quality survey data or anything, that most philosophers, including most meta-ethicists, were probably anti-realists. Realism has enjoyed a sort of dual renaissance through the latter half of the latter third, really, of the 20th century, which is, I believe in order, you first had a kind of resurgence of naturalist accounts. So you have like Boyd and some other people, Railton. And then you had a kind of a non-naturalist renaissance with Bruce Schaeffer Landau and a handful of other people that have come along. And now one of the most prominent ones, especially as far as like public engagement goes, is Mike Huemer, non-naturalist realist. And so realism has enjoyed a sort of it's like on the incline right now. And I don't know what's driving that. I don't know if that's because we're converging on the truth and the arguments have gotten better, or people have gotten, or whether it's a fashion, a trend. I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely think it is probably something like that, especially in questions of where the facts haven't really changed. The arguments are all the same, the structure of the arguments are all the same. I guess maybe it's disanalogous in the case of philosophy of religion, where you've had, the progress of science has maybe displaced God as an explanation for things. I don't know. I'm very cognizant of the fact that my battery is running low, so hopefully we get through. I only have 2 more questions for you, so
I can do questions all day. I don't know. This is just my day now.
Yeah. So these are just more philosophy of religion questions, but I've just sort of been playing with them in my mind. Do you think that error theory is compatible with theism?
So the first thing I should say is I am not a specialist in philosophy of religion, so I would say I don't really know. Sorry, I should hold on. Yes, it's compatible with theism, absolutely. Like there's no logical contradiction in thinking error theory is true and theism is true. I walk that back. That is absolutely is not going to be an issue. The substantive question I think would be: is error theory compatible with specific theological positions on the nature of God? So like certain forms of Christianity and other religions may or may not end up running up against problems with error theory.
Okay, that makes sense. I know because I've been exploring sort of more apathetic negative theology where God's goodness isn't really so much a central focus, or the word good is just radically reinterpreted so it doesn't mean anything that at least we would normally use in ordinary language. So I like that response.
Yeah,
One final
a
question.
quick point on that.
Yep.
If I may, that from the 2020 Field Paper Survey, you can also cross-reference responses from one question to another. And
Okay.
I think, don't quote me on this, you get something like 15% of theists also endorse anti-realism. So like
Okay.
at least people in the field don't seem to see them as radically incompatible.
That's interesting. I definitely want to talk to some of those anti-realist theists. That'd be a very interesting position to hold. But I have one final question. I think we touched on it a little bit, but um, you can go through it quickly if that works for you. So from your perspective, are there any moral arguments for or against the existence of God that move you or move people who share your views in any way?
Wait, did you say moral arguments or arguments?
Yeah, sorry, moral arguments.
No, I think you did say that. I was just wanting to be clear. So do I think that there can you just rephrase the question? Sorry.
Sorry, yeah. So do you think that there are any moral arguments for or against the existence of God that persuade you at all?
Not for God's existence. I do think that certain types of problems, like related to evil and suffering, like the stuff we observe in the world, um, seem to me to raise substantial philosophical concerns about particular properties one might be inclined to attribute to God. So, uh, I this might be a bit controversial, but I've seen Danny from Phil talk about the logical problem of evil, and I actually find Danny quite compelling on that account. That isn't to say that there might not be convincing rebuttals to that position, but at least when I hear that sort of thing, it strikes me as fairly convincing. Now the thing is, I don't think that those arguments, and I know Danny doesn't present them that way, they don't refute theism. They refute specific conceptions of the nature of God, like God is all knowing, all powerful, omnibenevolent, all those sorts of things. Basically, like the omni properties. The issue here would be that one might say, if there is a being that is supposed to have this particular set of characteristics, then it cannot. There's going to be inconsistency with those sets of characteristics and the things that we observe in the world around us. So those I actually find to be actually pretty convincing. The thing is, though, like I'm finding them convincing like over 20 years after I became an atheist. So what do I know? I don't know what force they would have on me were I a theist, and I don't know what force they have on others in the literature. All I could say is when I hear those arguments and then I hear rebuttals from Christians responding to them, I don't find the Christian replies to those very convincing. And that isn't because I uniformly find Christian replies to arguments from atheists unconvincing. I've seen a lot of extremely terrible and unconvincing arguments from like against theism. So it's like I often think these are good replies. And in this case, I just haven't found the replies very convincing.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, I don't have any more questions for you, so I really, 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 really do appreciate you taking the time and answering all my random questions and giving so much detail. It really does mean the world for me. And for all the viewers, definitely go check out Lance Independent. I think just type in LANC Independent on YouTube. Should be the first thing that comes up. But yeah, if you have any final thoughts.
No, well, I should just say thanks. Thanks for having me here. That was a fun discussion, and it was fun because I kind of just went everywhere. So I hope that is informative and useful for people. instead of it just being a big mess. So I at least I hope so. But I had a fun discussion. I hope it had some value.
Awesome. Well, I'll leave it there. Thanks everyone for watching. Like and subscribe. Follow me on all the social medias. I really should put my social medias up on my YouTube channel. I'll do that after this. But yeah, thank you once again. See ya.